Hi everyone, I'm Ava Asprakis. I'm based in Cyprus, not this week, as you will probably see from the very English-looking beams behind me. But Cyprus is where I live, and I write contemporary fiction novels. Most recently, one that drew on my experiences of infertility and pregnancy loss due to polycystic ovary syndrome. And since then, I've been a huge advocate for confessional writing as a form of emotional remedy. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so a few areas of discussion. I'll just hide my thumbnail there. We'll begin with an overview of confessional writing, so what it is, where it originated, and some of the criticisms and benefits associated with it. We'll look at examples of childlessness not by choice in literature. We'll discuss the basics of several types of confessional writing that you might like to try, including poetry, journaling, letter writing, personal essays, memoir, and autobiographical fiction. And again, we'll end with a Q&A session in which you'll also be welcome to share any writing that you've tried along the way if you would like. So to start off with, what comes to mind when you hear the term confessional writing? Would anyone like to share? I don't know if you want to just pop anything in the chat, Stephanie, if you can see anything there.
Can you see the chat yourself, or is it hidden now you've got
I
your...
can't actually, it's not coming up in my...
Right, okay.
No, I'm not able to see it, sorry.
That's all right, don't worry about it. Because if anyone's got any comments, a diary.
Oh, I've got it actually.
Oh, you can see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant.
But I don't know if that's going to disrupt my
I was
slide.
going to
Is
say,
that all right for you to read those out actually?
yeah, of course I can stay on there as audio. Um, so he's put a diary. Someone else said it sounds a bit religious, almost confessing yourself. And my thoughts were it's like sharing almost your secrets, the things you keep hidden.
Yeah, so I really like that about the religious element, especially. So again, it can kind of come in lots of different forms. So you've got journaling, I think someone mentioned a diary, autofiction, poetry, essays, but in essence, it's kind of seeking to convey and maybe even help you reach some kind of personal revelation. A common misconception, particularly I think when we're here in the context of childlessness not by choice, might be that confessional writing is all about trauma. So dredging up our most harrowing lived experiences only to drag ourselves through them again. It's true that our confessions can take us to dark places. So again, as someone mentioned there, in the Greek Orthodox Church in Cyprus, for example, we might confess to sins, things we feel remorseful for having done. Or in court, we might confess to crimes and receive prison sentences. So broadly, we have this idea of confessions as negatively charged, but they don't have to be. Rather than traumatic experiences, they could come from passions or habits that we keep to ourselves. Maybe you fantasize about becoming a concert pianist or will do anything to get out of answering the phone. Maybe in the context of childlessness, not by choice, which of course is so subjective. I would preface this obviously by just reminding us all of that. Maybe some of us have found unexpected consolations in not becoming parents that we might be hesitant to admit, or maybe we found no comfort at all in our situations and feel more resentful of them. In any case, confessional writing requires us to be honest with ourselves. It can be uncomfortable, even painful, but I think it can also bring us clarity and act as a remedy to some of our deepest troubles. So, a bit about the origins of confessional writing. The term confessional poetry became popular in September 1959 when the American critic M.L. Rosenthal used it in his review of Robert Lowell's Life Studies collection. In his review, Rosenthal called the collection a series of personal confidences, rather shameful that one is horror-bound not to reveal. Like most poets at the time, Lowell had focused on politics and religion in his earlier work. We all know the Oscar Wilde line about life imitating art, imitating life, and life in 1950s America was largely polite. It was shocking to see such personal matters as the marriage troubles that Lowell described in Life Studies, revealed publicly and by choice. Other poets whom we now consider founders of the confessional movement are Sylvia Plath, just the second picture in on the left, who wrote most famously about mental illness, Anne Sexton, who bulldozed the taboos around subjects like abortion and addiction, Dee Snodgrass, who openly mourns the loss of his daughter through divorce, and John Berryman, whose work returned frequently to his father's suicide. Of course, confessional writing is not without its criticisms. Does anyone want to maybe make a suggestion as to what those might be?
For me, I think
Okay.
possibly disbelief is one, or fantasy. Guilt is coming up. Self-indulgent.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah,
So
somebody else has
actually,
said the same. Self-indulgent again.
yeah, I think yes, about a year after his review of Robert Lowell's Life Studies collection, M.L. Rosenthal actually published a book called The Modern Poets: A Critical Introduction, in which he compared the confessional poets of his time to the romantic poets of the late 18th century. He named John Keats an example as an example of one who had transcended his personal complaint and written instead around the key romantic themes of nature, the supernatural, and what Rosenthal called a more universal forlornness. So, yes, since the beginning of the movement, confessional writing has definitely been seen by some as self indulgent. Even Dee Snodgrass, named as one of those founding confessional poets, rejected the label, saying it suggested either that you were writing something religious and were confessing something of that sort, or that you were writing bedroom memoirs, and I wasn't doing that either. Since the blogging boom of the early 2000s, we've also seen an industry accelerate around confessional writing. In 2015, Slate features director Laura Bennett took a cynical view of this with her article, The First Person Industrial Complex, in which she described editors looking to elevate their pieces above the swarm by quoting people who had published their personal essays to the internet without paying those people for their work. Other editors echoed Bennett's concerns about the exploitation of confessional writers, with Salon's Sarah Heppeler saying, I tried to warn them that their internet trail will be I was a BDSM person, and they did it for $150. And Jezebel's Gia Tolentino lamenting that so many writers have been made to feel like the best thing they have to offer is the worst thing that ever happened to them. In her article, Bennett concludes that while the personal essay economy affords a platform to voices that might not otherwise receive mainstream attention, it can be risky, especially for women. Bennett warns, aside from the fact that the confessional essay as a form has historically attracted more women than men, many of the outlets that are most hungry for quick freelancer copy and have the lowest barriers to entry for publication are still women's interest sites. She's right in suggesting that the term confessional can be used to demean women's writing in particular. A high-profile example from recent times, I think, is Sally Rooney, who's just pictured in the middle there. And she's come under fire for setting her novels at the university she attended and for describing things like writing and female sexuality in ways that her critics have decided is distastefully personal. In 2017, writer Michelle Filgate hosted a Red Ink panel discussion, part of a series focused on female writers, about literary misfits, in which she pointed out that women receive far more criticism than men for writing confessionally. Author and panelist Melissa Phoebos agreed that this was insanely sexist, stating that being emotional is associated with the female. The intellectual is valued higher and associated with the male. Moving swiftly on to the benefits of confessional writing. What do we think those might be? Does anyone have any ideas?
Just waiting for people to write their thoughts into the chat box.
I'd hope we'd have a few more answers for the positive.
Sweet release,
Yes.
actually put. Getting your feelings out of your head, cathartic, release, self-discovery, finding clarity, forgiveness, and moving forward.
Oh, lovely. Yeah. So I personally hesitate to give them too much credit. But the critics of confessional writing are right, as everyone has sort of suggested there, to compare confessing to confiding and to cite the psychological benefits that can come from doing that. Online platforms like Psychology Tools and Very Well Mind recommend writing therapy as a cheap and accessible way to ease any feelings of emotional distress left over from traumatic events. So there is, again, clearly a sense of catharsis for confessional writers, and maybe for their readers too. In a 2014 Guardian article titled Confessional Writing is Not Self-Indulgent, personal essayist Leslie Jamieson described being inundated with notes from strangers who'd read her book and wanted to share their stories in return. Because, in Jamieson's words, confession doesn't just allow, it incites. When reading other authors' confessional works, she said, I didn't feel excluded. I felt my whole life summoned into the narrative, thus disproving the idea that writing from personal experience is a purely selfish endeavour. I would like to add my own observation as well, which is that almost every criticism of confessional writing, at least that I've heard, is more about the publication of confessional writing than it is about the practice of it. I can certainly say from my own experience with infertility and pregnancy loss that the practice of confessional writing has been a wholly healing one. So, with that, let's look at some examples of childlessness in existing literature. Has anyone seen a portrayal of it they'd like to share, whether you liked it or not? There's not too many around. I did actually have to look quite hard and sort of go out of my way to find some of these books, but really, really enjoyed them once I did.
I think there's slowly becoming a few more that exist,
Yes,
but you say
definitely.
it's slow progress.
Well, we can go over these and maybe get some recommendations out. So these, again, are a few that I thought were interesting. Firstly, Expectation on the far left by Anna Hope follows London-based friends Lissa, Kate, and Hannah as they navigate the disjunct between the lives they'd each imagined for themselves and the lives that they're actually living. Despite multiple rounds of IVF, Hannah has been unable to conceive and is desperately unhappy. I think this book does a really good job of displaying the resentment that infertility can lead to, with envy coming between Hannah and her friend Kate, who appears to take her own comparatively quite effortless conception for granted, and with problems arising in Hannah's marriage to Nathan as their communication breaks down. Much of the book's insight stems from the author's real life experience of watching her peers fall pregnant very quickly, while she suffered with recurrent miscarriage. And for our next example, just the next book in from the left, Letter to a Child Never Born by the Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci. It's a short book written in the style of a letter to the child that its protagonist has fallen pregnant with. According to David Sanford's 1975 Esquire article, The Lady of the Tapes, Fallaci had never married but had been pregnant 3 times, with each pregnancy ending in a miscarriage. In the article, Sanford reported that Fallaci's greatest sadness was her inability to bear a child. That sadness comes through powerfully in this book, when the protagonist tries herself in an imagined courtroom for the crime of losing her child. It's especially thought-provoking around the complexities of childlessness for someone who wasn't sure whether they wanted a child to begin with. Yeah, and that scene has really stayed with me personally as well. It was beautifully written, which kind of almost makes it more difficult in some ways. And finally, Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo depicts the fallout of a childless marriage in Nigeria. In a 2017 Literary Hub article titled Writing About Infertility in a World That Sees Childless Marriage as Tragedy, Adebayo described holding her breath until her newlywed friends announced their first pregnancies, and hearing stories of women who had struggled to conceive stuffing their shirts to make themselves appear pregnant before their marriages ended or became polygamous in some cases. With so much pressure put upon women like her to bear children, it's no wonder that the protagonist, Yejide, takes extreme measures to overcome her infertility. I think, again, this book gives a vivid impression of the lengths that despair can drive us to, as well as the external pressures that can come with childlessness. And a few more recommendations I'd give, though I'm not sure whether they are as true to their authors' lived experiences as those we've just discussed, are Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason, which centers around mental health and childlessness. Starling Days by Rowan Hosea Buchanan, which touches on the infertility risk associated with polycystic ovary syndrome and also quite a bit on mental health. And Breast and Eggs by Miko Kawakami, which deconstructs the societal pressures on women to have children in the quote, right way at the right time, unquote, and the toll that that can take. Motherhood by Sheila Heti is also interesting on those pressures and the way that they can cause us as women, especially, I think, to second guess ourselves. So we've seen some examples of childlessness in literature, in fiction, but as we discussed before, there are different ways to write confessionally. So we have poetry, with the founding confessional poets being those we talked about before, Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, and so on. There's journaling, with probably the most famous example being Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl, in which she recorded her time spent hiding from the Nazis during the Second World War. There's letter writing. The collection Love Nina is a really good example of that, written over the course of 5 years by Nina Stibble, who was working as a nanny for the London Review of Books editor at the time. There are personal essays, which again have proved hugely popular in recent years. Emily Ratajkowski's collection My Body sparked debates around society's commodification of women's bodies and whether or not it was empowering for women to embrace their sexualization. There's memoir. A favourite example of mine, I Am by the novelist Maggie O'Farrell, actually touches on miscarriage in quite a moving way and is written beautifully, so I'd really recommend that. And of course, there's autobiographical fiction, or sometimes called creative nonfiction, which is another form that many writers, including myself, have turned to in recent times. So yeah, I mean, the recommendations there could be endless. But an iconic example is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, who again is one of our founding confessional writers. Now that we've got an example of each form, let's have a look at how to get started. I think even if some of us have tried writing in these ways before, it can be really helpful to go back to the basics and remember as well that confessional poetry, along with confessional writing more broadly, is an emotional outlet. So I don't want any of us to get too hung up on kind of counting syllables and lose fluidity in what we're doing. Instead, let's think about how we can use poetic devices to explore the experience of childlessness and build our poems out from there. A device that I think could be central to this is juxtaposition, where you contrast one thing with another to highlight the difference between them. So a starting point here might be to juxtapose the hopes or expectations that you'd had of becoming a parent with the reality of remaining childless and how that's made you feel. Come up with a comparison. What has that difference felt like? And there you'll have a simile, which is another emotive device. Other devices that could help you to express yourself here are personification, where you apply human qualities to non-human things. Maybe you feel that your 10th negative pregnancy test was laughing at you, for example, and could characterize it as malicious in some way. If you want to make a comparison in a stronger way than with a simile, you could use a metaphor. So rather than saying that life without children is like a desert, you could say that it is a desert and use imagery to kind of ground your reader in that experience. So the desert of childlessness, stretching in every direction and scorching your feet with every step, or something to that effect. And the beauty of poetry is that it's as versatile as the experience of childlessness is subjective. So there's really no wrong way of writing it. If you're just getting started, I'd say choose one of these devices as a prompt and just see where it takes you. I'll read the first stanza of Robert Lowell's Home After 3 Months Away as an example. Gone now the baby's nurse, a lioness who ruled the roost and made the mother cry. She used to tie gobbets of pork rind in bow knots of gauze. 3 months they hung like soggy toast on our 8-foot magnolia tree, and helped the English sparrows weather a Boston winter. It's somewhat cryptic in that it's an older poem, so we might use more accessible language today. But Home After 3 Months Away was considered one of Lowell's most confessional poems, with 3 months away referring to a period of his institutionalization for mental illness. Already in those first few lines, we get a sense clearly of how deeply he feels affected by his return through his use of similes and imagery. He puts us where he is emotionally by describing those sensory experiences vividly. If you're newer to confessional writing, journaling could be a good place to start. It's so lacking in rules that I think it really just allows you to be yourself in a more relaxed way than something like memoir, for example. The way that you describe the same one event could be completely different in these two forms. I think with memoir, there's an implication that you intend for other people to read what you've written. And so you might find yourself writing in a more formal or self-conscious tone. Whereas with journaling, the idea is that what you're recording will just be for you. You don't have to worry about how well it reads or how personal it is. I'd recommend doing it with a pen and paper so you don't even have things like spell check to bother you. Start by making yourself comfortable with a hot drink or some music. Write the date at the top of your page and then whatever comes to mind. You might ease yourself in by writing about what you've been doing on a surface level before confessing to deeper concerns. It could even give you a helpful structure to write a sentence about something you did, followed by a sentence about how it made you feel, and then a sentence about what you think on reflection. The key is to make your journaling a consistent practice. So find a time each day or week where you can fit it in and stick with that. In time, you might see your thoughts coming together in a way that you'd like to present more formally, or maybe the journaling alone will give you the catharsis that you're looking for. The Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank's diary, as we mentioned earlier, opens with this. 12th of June, 1942. I hope I'll be able to confide everything to you, as I have never been able to confide in anyone, and I hope you'll be a great source of comfort and support. 14th of June, 1942. I'll begin from the moment I got you, the moment I saw you lying on the table among my other birthday presents. I went along when you were bought, but that doesn't count. On Friday, the 12th of June, I was awake at 6 o'clock, which isn't surprising since it was my birthday. But I'm not allowed to get up at that hour, so I had to control my curiosity until 7:15. When I couldn't wait any longer, I went to the dining room, where Mortje, the cat, welcomed me by rubbing against my legs. A little after 7, I went to Mummy and Daddy and then to the living room to open my presents, and you were the first thing I saw, maybe one of my nicest presents. Anne goes on to list the rest of her presents in quite a colloquial tone, as you heard. She doesn't try to dress up the mundanity of her experiences, which again is what journaling is kind of all about, is the everyday. By being so unself-conscious and including asides about her diary being, maybe quite a nice present, she feels familiar and I would imagine more comfortable in her writing as well. Letter writing could also be a good place to start in terms of giving your confessional piece a clear shape and direction. Of course, we have different kinds of letters to play with. So we have love letters, letters of complaint, letters of condolence or apology, letters of resignation or of reference from our employers, the letters we write into birthday, anniversary, or get well soon cards, hate mail, fan mail. So lots of different templates for expressing ourselves. First and foremost, if you want to try this, I would say it's important to think about how being childless has made you feel, what it's made you think, whether it's changed your behavior, and then decide, is there someone who you wish you could say these things to, whether that's for their benefit or for your own sense of closure. Maybe it's the child you never had, the partner you fear you pulled away from, or the parent you feel you disappointed somehow. Think about who you most want to direct your thoughts to and address your letter to them. Of course, you never have to send it, but this should just help you to channel your feelings constructively. The Book of Letters Love Nina opens with this. Dear Vic, it's fantastic here. The house, the street, London. You can hear the zoo animals waking up in the morning. Mary Kay is funny. Nothing bothers her much, except she can't stand having too much milk in the fridge. They have skimmed. Her and Sam and Will all have the same basin haircut. Apart from that, she's quite fashionable. She swears a lot, F and C, and reminds me of Elspeth, but not in Alki. So what we see here is that because the writer, Nina, is addressing her sister, she can get straight to the detail of what she wants to say. She doesn't have to hinder the flow of her thoughts with any exposition or explanations as to who's who. Presumably her sister would already know this information, and so Nina can write kind of uninterrupted. Hopefully by addressing your letter to a particular person in your life, you'll be able to do the same. Personal essays are generally more structured, but that's not to say that they have to read very formally. We tend to write them with the intention of conveying a lesson from our own lived experiences in first person and in a fairly conversational tone, as we want to connect with the reader. This could be a good form if you're someone who looks to humour in difficult moments, if you feel you've made mistakes and want your readers to learn from them. There's room for some dryness or self-deprecation. Or if you feel you've grown from what you've been through and want to inspire others to do the same, you could take a gentler and more encouraging tone. So again, there are different ways we can choose to express ourselves here. The first thing to ask yourself, a bit like with letter writing, is who am I directing my message to and why? Sum that message up in 1 or 2 sentences, and that's the hook with which you're going to start your introduction. Once you've given readers an idea of what's to come, you can move on to the body of your essay, the paragraphs in which you'll describe the experiences that have shaped your point of view. If you want to write something powerful, I'd suggest focusing on a single specific event if you can, rather than giving a broad overview. For example, you could detail the baby shower that you went to while struggling with infertility, as opposed to how you feel that your infertility has affected you overall. You will be able to convey that, I think, in a more sort of show, don't tell way through the microcosm of the one experience. And once you've written that, usually in about 4 or 5 paragraphs, you can conclude by reiterating the point that you made in your introduction and summing up the morals you want your readers to take away. To look at another of our earlier examples, the model Emily Ratajkowski's collection of essays, My Body, opens with this passage. When you were born, my mother begins, the doctor held you up and said, look at the size of her. She's beautiful. And you were. She smiles. I've heard this story many times. The next day, he brought his children to the hospital just to see you. You were such a beautiful baby. This is where the recital normally ends, but this time my mother is not done. A familiar, innocent expression spreads across her face before she continues, one I'm used to seeing right before she says something to me or my father that she knows maybe she shouldn't. I brace myself. So you can see there, we've got the conversational tone, the author setting us up right away for the experience that she wants us to learn from. It's a serious non-fiction piece with a kind of storytelling feel. Moving on to memoir. Firstly, I'd say memoirs are true accounts. Of course, we might not recall every detail of our experiences perfectly, but we shouldn't be aiming to edit or exaggerate them. That's generally more for autobiographical fiction. Similarly, trying to cover an entire life story is for autobiography. A memoir should focus on one situation or period of your life and what you learned from it. It might span the 5 years in which you struggled with recurrent miscarriage, for example, or your final round of IVF. To get started, I'd advise coming up with a 1-sentence summary that includes who you are, what you faced, and what it taught you. Going with the recurrent miscarriage example, you might say something like, when her 5th pregnancy ends in miscarriage, a budding artist accepts life without children and learns what there is to be gained from loss. Just in one instance. Using that sentence as a guideline, you should then get a sense of the themes and events that belong in your memoir. You could even make a list of any memories that feel in keeping with those, and again, try to focus on them and not get sidetracked by details that are not so relevant. They might be interesting, but you can always save them for another piece of writing. My final suggestion when it comes to drafting is that you start your memoir with an impactful moment. In our artist's case, that might be the moment of her final miscarriage. So immediately we have a scene that illustrates what this book is going to be about and that is going to hopefully hook our reader. I Am, the memoir I mentioned earlier by the novelist Maggie O'Farrell, is told through scenes of her near-death experiences and opens with this. On the path ahead, stepping out from behind a boulder, a man appears. We are, he and I, on the far side of a dark tarn that lies hidden in the bowl-curved summit of this mountain. The sky is a milky blue above us. No vegetation grows this far up, so it is just me and him, the stones and the still black water. He straddles the narrow track with both booted feet, and he smiles. I realise several things. That I passed him earlier, further down the glen. We greeted each other, in the amiable yet brief manner of those on a country walk. That on this remote stretch of path, there is no one near enough to hear me call. That he has been waiting for me. He has planned this whole thing, carefully, meticulously, and I have walked into his trap. I see all this in an instant. Aside from the fact that her writing is just brilliant, I have chills reading that and I've read it 3 times. It demonstrates, I think, what we've just discussed. So, opening with an impactful moment and showing the reader what they can expect from the book. Again, I'd really recommend it to anyone interested in memoir. And finally, we have autobiographical fiction, or creative nonfiction, as it's sometimes called. This form gives us more room for imagination than memoir, as we kind of touched on before. It enables us to tell true stories using literary devices that we would normally associate with fiction. So again, that's maybe personification or narrative arcs, which can make our accounts uniquely compelling. As with memoir, it's important to stay on point. So I'd advise that same first step of listing your relevant themes and experiences. You might also look into some history or statistics around the subject matter you're writing about, whether that's endometriosis or male factor infertility, to ground your story in its place and time. As well as those facts, describing feelings is a great way to make your account feel vivid, less like a report and more like a novel. Don't just tell the reader that your PCOS causes you to have acne, for example. Tell them that you grit your teeth when you catch sight of it in a mirror. Make the image evocative. And as with all forms of confessional writing, end on a note of reflection and give your reader something to take away with them. Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar begins, "It was a queer, sultry summer, the summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs, and I didn't know what I was doing in New York. I'm stupid about executions. The idea of being electrocuted makes me sick, and that's all there was to read about in the papers. Goggle-eyed headlines staring up at me on every street corner and at the fusty, peanut-smelling mouth of every subway. It had nothing to do with me, but I couldn't help wondering what it would be like, being burned alive along all your nerves. I thought it must be the worst thing in the world." The Bell Jar tells the story of a young woman's descent into mental illness and depression, largely. So you can see again here that the author establishes that theme of dark thinking from the outset. She also does a good job of setting the story in its place and time, I think, by referencing those headlines. Again, a really, really good read for anyone looking for autobiographical fiction inspiration. So those are all the forms of confessional writing that we plan to cover today. Each is a little different, but I think there are some key elements kind of across the board. Does everyone agree? Are there overarching lessons or ideas that you feel you can take away from this? Please do feel free to share.
For me personally, I think it's literally the biggest scary thing is putting pen to paper.
Yeah, getting started, I think.
Do you know what I mean? But it's finding where you feel comfortable and how that takes form. People are saying that they're taking loads of helpful notes so far, and
Oh,
it's a really
amazing.
good overview. So they're appreciating what you've actually been sharing with us.
Oh, I'm glad. Yeah, so I mean, keys I would sort of say, just to round up as well on any takeaways. Again, some variations across forms, but fundamentally, I think you need to know your audience. So touching back to the letter writing, and thinking about who you're addressing your words to. Do your research, put your experiences into a broader context. Be specific. Don't just tell me what happened. Tell me how it made you feel. And above all, be honest, be vulnerable. That's what confessional writing is all about. And, I think that's how you'll get the greatest benefits out of doing it, that catharsis and that sense of closure. I would also add that while confessional writing, like any form of therapy, takes work, it should also feel instinctive on some level. Hopefully, as we went through those different forms, you felt drawn to one or two of them in particular. To give a kind of personal anecdote, although I poured the grief from my own infertility and pregnancy loss into a work of autobiographical fiction, my first confessional writing was actually a journal that I started keeping when I was around 9 years old, in response to my mum's ectopic pregnancy. She and my then stepfather, now adoptive father, were not able to have children together. And I guess, I don't know, I sort of didn't think about this until I was putting this together. But I guess I took that to heart from a kind of would-be sibling perspective. And I kept addressing my journal entries to Penelope, which was a name that my parents had liked, for the next couple of years. little did I know, obviously, that writing confessionally about childlessness was something that I would go on to do as an adult and as a professional. I was just following an instinct. So I think that's the best piece of advice I can give anyone for getting started is just write what you feel and to kind of trust that. And if anyone has any questions, or wants to share any writing that you've tried along the way, um, I don't know if you're comfortable putting that in the chat, maybe we could read some of those out.
If that's your last slide, do you want to come back to the screen so you can actually read the chat
Yeah.
yourself? And there is one question in there. I know a few people have been mentioning that they do the letter writing, that they like the idea of that and journaling as well.
Oh yeah. Oh, I like that from Sarah about the modern world of tech kind of replacing letter writing as a form of communication. Yeah, very true. And I think with texting, we're much less thoughtful. So even though you're still kind of writing your thoughts down, it's just not the same, is it? There's not that level of kind of standing back and really considering your words in a way that could, really help you to kind of channel your thoughts like that. Um,
Oh, the question is an interesting one that might be relevant to you. It actually says, has anyone else experienced writing in their own language and in their second language? I have. It is extremely inspiring.
oh wow. I do you know I am desperate to get better with my Greek so that I can try to kind of do that as well because I'd be really interested to see how feelings translated over because I think we have different words for different emotions obviously in each language. And from what I understand, some languages there are fewer words, so it's maybe almost harder to express yourself specifically um, and then vice versa as well. So yeah, I would be really interested to know. Unfortunately, I don't feel I'm yet at a level where I could really kind of delve into that. But yeah, that's for sure. I think that would be a really, really interesting way to kind of explore your own depths almost emotionally. Um, yeah, I like this point as well about writing by hand being slower and making you more kind of reflective. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Because again, I just think we're so used now to being on our phones or even at a laptop with a keyboard where you can just kind of go and almost not think. And I don't know if everyone has this enabled. I almost want to try and switch it off if I can find a way. But in email now, you kind of get halfway through a sentence and it predicts the whole rest of the sentence for you. And all you have to do is hit the tab button and it will just fill it in. Which apart from being really disconcerting that it can kind of read your mind, um, I do think it kind of stops you from needing to really think about your words, which again, it's such a powerful thing to do in terms of thinking about your feelings as well, because when you verbalize, you're kind of, yeah, you're taking something out of your head. And, it's important to be able to do that, I think, authentically in almost any format, even if it is just kind of a quite a basic email, it's that uh consistent practice of just thinking when you express yourself, I suppose.
You've got a second question as well, which is, do you believe that the ability to blog anonymously has increased the number of people writing confessionally online? If so, do you see being anonymous in publishing confessional writing as a positive or a negative thing?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I think it can go both ways, can't it? It's for the person writing, I should imagine that's probably quite freeing. Um, because you have that sense of I can say anything and I don't have to hold back almost from expressing everything that I want to. Um, but then I suppose it comes back to that thing of where is the criticism? Is it of the practice of confessional writing? No, probably not. Um, but when it comes to the publication, so in the blogging context, I suppose it could be problematic if what you're saying could potentially come back around and hurt someone else. Um, so I suppose it depends on the context in which you're kind of wanting to express yourself, and how public that is. Like, what kind of forum are you posting it in, and what's kind of the aim of sharing it. Um, oh, that's interesting from Kathy. So yes, writing in English flows and German is a challenge to keep it more direct. Yeah, so again, some differences in language as well, kind of affecting that. Oh, and this from Joe. I used to sometimes write in my left hand, non-dominant hand, which is meant to help you reach into a deeper level. I can imagine purely because it would slow me down so much that that would probably be true. Yeah, so again, that kind of just slowing the pace and allowing yourself by doing that to really take a beat and consider. Yeah, that's an interesting exercise actually. I might try that. Just trying to see if I've missed any more questions.
I don't think there are any more specific questions, just comments referring what people have found useful for themselves. And I think, like I say, a few are writing about writing letters.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a lovely one. I think oh wow, someone has said, yeah, Kathy has said here. I wrote many letters over the course of last year and actually sent them to that person, not expecting a response. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? It's so kind of personal to you. Again, it's almost like unburdening yourself is kind of the main point of the exercise. So it's almost, I don't want to say it's irrelevant, kind of what the recipient would think, because maybe in some cases you really do feel the need to kind of say something directly to someone, and maybe writing is the best way for you to do that and send it on. But I think just that act of sort of saying, here is everything I think. Maybe I never said it to this person for some reason, or I didn't feel that I could. Um, and you kind of just release it, but still in a way that feels as though you're addressing whoever you want to, without necessarily having to have a conversation that would be really uncomfortable for you in some way. I think there's still a really big benefit there. Um, Yeah, yeah. And Emma saying as well, sometimes just stopping and writing how you feel in that moment can be really powerful. Yeah, completely agree. And I think, especially in the context of childlessness, not by choice as well, it's something that you can feel really alone with. And as much as this week is absolutely brilliant, and I think, bringing people together kind of around these conversations is going to make so much difference. I think in day-to-day life, it's really easy to feel like no one understands, no one, even if you tell them what you're going through, you're kind of alone in your body. And again, with this being so subjective, of an experience, it's like no one can be in that with you. So they can't totally understand, even if they can empathize exactly what you're going through. Um, and that, even with people having the best will in the world around you, I think that is inevitably going to be lonely to some extent. So yeah, so having that ability and that outlet of being able to say, okay, when I talk to other people, they don't get it. If I can just release these things, yeah, I think it can make a huge, huge difference. And Janine saying perfect timing, as she's starting to write a memoir essay. That's brilliant. Did anyone want to share any bits of writing? I don't know if I've missed anything. I think I'm
I don't think anybody shared writing. They've just been listening intently to what you've been sharing.
lovely. Um, yeah, well, if that's it, if that's everybody's questions and things, um,
I think so for now.
yeah.
So thank you very much. If you feel that's come to a conclusion for you.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to everybody that came, and I really hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights as well. And I look forward maybe to reading some of you one day if you ever want to obviously go kind of more public with what you've written. yeah, I would love if people reached out. You can find me on Instagram. It's just my name. Yeah, I'd love to know what you're all working on. So thank you.